All right, this is a largest group, but we do our best to make it more even a conversation, even with a group this large. So I will ask that before you ask a question directed to any of our panelists, that you identify yourself, even though many of us know each other, we don't all know each other. So the floor is now open. I know that there will be this will be a lively session. So who would like to get us started? Father Bill Miss Campbell, Department of History. I'll introduce you so you don't
Thanks very much, Kathy, in case I forget. Thanks very much for your book, and thanks for those two wonderful comments. I teach what Rebecca would probably see as sort of an old-fashioned field.
Disgusting.
U.S. diplomatic history, yeah. And I wrote a book a long time ago on George Kennan. I was able to interview John Patton Davies. You put him on your cover.
Yes.
Interviewed him in his beautiful home in North Carolina. An impressive man. I'm glad you gave attention to him in the book. But my question relates a little bit to the overestimation of the impact that I think was raised by Professor Griffith. John Service and John Patton Davies get a lot of attention. They're interesting characters, but in a sense, they have limited impact on America's policy towards China once Mao comes to power. The group that in a way has much more impact are all those missionaries who are expelled from China by Mao's rampaging communism that wants to eliminate Western influence in the country. Henry Luce is sort of connected to them. You touch very briefly on the China lobby, but you give no attention to those thousands of people, Protestants and Catholics, who were expelled, or I know better the Catholic side, those Catholics who were imprisoned, tortured. The Marian old Bishop Walsh would be the classic character, imprisoned there for years and years, etc., etc. So here's the question. Your book strikes me as a very mainline Protestant, post-Protestant book that excludes from the story these amazing missionaries. Now I'm looking just at the case study of China. You give attention to Davies, no problem with that, but give no attention to these other folks who are, if you may get to Rebecca's point, they're not quite as literate. They didn't write as many books, etc. They're not as easy for you to get at. I'd be curious as to your sort of response of who gets in and who gets left out of your story. And I mean, this group in the 50s are deeply influential in how America thinks about China. It's rampaging Red China, anti-Christian, persecuting, etc., etc. That's the image that gets into the American mind.
All that you say, Bill, is very interesting to me. I would make sort of two comments about that. First, with regard to John Patton Davies and John Service and other people in that cohort, the main points that I tried to make about them were first, that they failed. And the key sentence in the book is that the Missionary Cosmopolitans lost their most important battle. So their significance was partly that they put that flag up, they articulated that point of view, they are representative of those missionary cosmopolitans that were eager for the United States to develop alliances with the self-declared interests of non-white, decolonizing people. I try to say at the end of that chapter that the significance of the China hands was not what they achieved, but what was done to them. So they are important as a point of entry into the ways in which the United States government orients itself to East Asia. So their significance is not what they achieved, but what happened to them and their lives as fields on which all this power relations goes forward. Second thing, on these other people that you talk about, I would be interested in knowing how to locate their presence in the public affairs of the country, because I found that there were very few of them in the China lobby. So I talk a lot about Walter Judd, but I corresponded with Joyce Mao, the chief authority, the author of a wonderful book on the China lobby, and asked her to provide me with the names of missionary types who were involved in the China lobby. She wrote back there were very few. Now, the closest thing that I found to what you're talking about are the interviews done by the former China missionaries in 1971 at Pilgrim Place at the congregational retirement home in Southern California. They interviewed several dozen former China missionaries. Now, these people are generally very hostile to the Kuomintang. They're ambivalent about the communist revolution. But these are people who, many of them were church workers or involved somehow in ecclesiastical institutions. But I did not find very many arenas in the public space where they were important. But I would be glad to be corrected on that and glad to count this as an example of additional research that somebody needs to do.
Could I just have a brief follow-up?
Please.
I'm not suggesting that they were influential in the public space. Most of these missionaries went off to other missionary places.
Right.
I know I have a brother who's a Franciscan, worked in Malaysia, Singapore, etc. Their mission was started by people who were kicked out of China. They went to another place. I met an old American there in the late 1970s who was still waiting for his chance to get back into China. So they didn't come back to the United States. But what the China lobby does is use the example of their being expelled, the persecution of them, to form a vision of China. You see, it's at one hand removed. It's not that they're the policymakers, it's what happens to how they're utilized.
I would just add, if I might briefly, that something that I came across which I think deserves further study, although it's not quite in the frame of reference of what I was working on, is all these missionaries that were interned by the Japanese for sometimes 2 and 3 years. And I quote the famous Langdon Gilkey book, Shanghai Compound, but there's a lot of other stuff on it that's out there in the sources but is not analyzed. For example, I found an amazing bunch of letters from the missionaries as soon as they are let out of the camps and they get on the Griffith, the Swedish liner that takes them back. They write thousands of letters. So these are letters that describe the missionary experience and the internment experience in China. And so far as I know, there's never been a monograph done on that body of sources.
Thank you. Tom.
I think it was a great book. And
Tom Tweed, University of Notre Dame.
I'm here. I think Bill would love this book, and I think it advances lots of conversations. I'm really grateful. The most annoying kind of question is always the kind of question about what's left out, and many of us, we could ask more Catholic questions. But let me just ask a big question and then make one suggestion. Where's the public arena? Where is public life? I think if you define it in a certain way, this book does a really good job of what it set out to do. And the most annoying thing for authors is always to have somebody say, could you have written a different book?
I'm annoyed already.
Well, stay tuned. It could get worse. But, so I apologize in advance, but I think I'll leave it to my colleagues to talk more about how Catholics could work in. But I think that the most obvious omission to me is Lottie Moon. So if you're talking about the largest, like where's the public sphere? I don't know. But the largest, the Catholic Church is obvious. The largest Protestant denomination is Southern Baptist. Lottie Moon is the major person who seems to me really important for a whole range of folks who are religious. Every single Southern Baptist knows her name, and she's really significant. She's now, there's images of her as a kind of feminist mother for all sorts of things. Regina Sullivan's 2011 book was out. I don't think you mentioned her. Maybe I missed it.
The Lottie Moon is, excuse me.
Why not Lottie Moon?
Yeah, okay.
She's the most famous example of something of which there are actually a great many examples. And these are the missionaries who are mistreated or killed abroad, the martyrs. And the literature on that is actually vast, and it's distinctly an ecclesiastical literature. It's a church-bound literature. You find it in the religious periodicals. And I didn't deal very much with that. I allude to it occasionally. The Lottie Moon story, I found extremely few references to outside the closely bounded religious literature. Now, I agree with you that the question of the boundaries of the public, what counts as public life, is something that's debatable, and my sense of it is very conventional. So I'm talking about, institutions like the Foreign Service, other foreign agencies, major civil rights organizations, universities, foundations. So, and the Protestant churches insofar as they were players, which they absolutely were. I mean, the Federal Council of Churches and all these people, Atchison showing up at the National Cathedral to give speeches, that kind of stuff. So that's what I mean by public. Now, one of the things that I hope will happen as a result of this book, if I can claim some credit for pushing people in that direction, is to talk about missionary consequences in other domains that are not within what I'm strictly describing as the public. And the Mormons are a great example of that. And I would be glad for others.
Yes,
Harold Hart, Hillsdale College. I'll stand up so I can see David. I'm going to frame this by asking if you knew then what you know now, how you might have written post-ethnic America. So one of the things I was struck by in reading this is that you have this category of post-Protestant identity, and in post-ethnic America you had a post-ethnic identity where it seemed that ethnic identities could retain some of their rootedness but then lose some of it. But in this case with post-Protestants, at least the Protestants you're identifying, they lose their Protestant identity. And so it doesn't seem like they're really Protestant anymore. They really are post-Protestant. So there's no rootedness in this case. And so this is a way maybe of getting at the evangelical ecumenical problem. At the end, you talk about a spectrum of religious liberals and post-Protestant missionary types. Is there a way also of putting on that spectrum of, is it cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitanisms? And I know you have a recent contribution to the collection, New York University Press book, but is there a way of including evangelical ecumenical types as still, say, Protestant, post-Protestants in a way? But the larger question is, how has your mind changed on cosmopolitanism and post-ethnic identity, and where would you situate Protestants in that?
So taking annoying to another level, we're not asking you how you would have written this book differently. We're asking you how you would have written a book you published in 1999 differently. Thank you, Darrell, for that.
It's even worse. That was 1995.
Oh, 1995.
But the posting, and I'm one of a lot of people that talk about post this and post that, could be construed as a lack of analytic imagination. And it's difficult to change vocabularies that we have inherited, and I've tried to do it with those terms. I actually haven't changed my mind at all about what I wrote in that post-ethnic book, and I think the recent stuff on identity politics, I'm a little annoyed at Mark Lilla and others that seem to make a critique of identity politics that I don't, it seems to me a little cruder than the one that I made, but I basically have been blown out of the water by Mark and all these people now that are making a different kind of argument. So I still stand by what I said then, and what I think is pertinent, Darrell, to what you're talking about is that from the start, I regarded post-ethnic, as I now regard post-Protestant, as something that happens along a spectrum. So the post-ethnic people that I was talking about, they're no longer affirming ethnic identity in that firm and singular way, and that they are still formed by it. So the thing about post-ethnic is that it's both post and it's ethnic, as in the precursor. Well, I got the idea from post-Marxist, from these French philosophers talking about post-Marxism being Marxist, but also being post. So it's an idea of a spectrum there, and I feel even more strongly about that with my use of post-Protestant. So I use the term post-Protestant for people that no longer affirm Protestant affiliation, Protestant faith, Protestant identity, but are clearly formed by it, and in many cases are not hostile toward it. You know, they just move on to something else. So I think that post-Protestant secularism is very close to ecumenical Protestantism, and that it's a blurry line, and that some people just sort of gradually move from one to the other. But a difficulty that we've had with the concept of the secular, and maybe this, Darrell, is the point that I'm most eager to make, is that we talk about the secular as a monolith, whereas I want to break down the secular into a variety of more specific orientations. And it seems to me that a great deal of what we call secular has been formed by the ecumenical Protestant tradition in the United States. So lots of the folks that we say, oh, well, they're secular. I mean, the mainstream churches have all declined. The mainline churches have declined. Where did all these people go? Well, I'm saying that they went into something that I like to call post-Protestantism, where there's still considerable impact of the tradition. So in this book, when I talk about some of my cast of characters as post-Protestants, I'm trying to get across the reality of the formation. So it's not as though when you become secular that all this stuff that formed you when you were younger is gone. It's there as a set of resources, as a set of stuff, as a set of cultural, psychological things that you deploy in different ways in a secular context. So I appreciate your mentioning the earlier book. It gives me a chance to complain about Mark Lowell.
Andy?
Thank you very much, Andy Mack from University of Notre Dame. I'm struck in many of the subjects that you're dealing with, whether it's Henry Luce or even the stories of Pearl Buck to The King and I, how often that the characters in this book are speaking to general audiences and to federal officials. And so I'm interested in writing this book and thinking about it now that it's out in the public sphere. What were your hopes for the audience not in this room? What do you want those general audience readers or the PBS and NPR crowd bring up earlier? Or the takeaways that you hope that this book will bring not just to the academics in the audience, but to Americans and to missionary organizations more generally?
I guess the best answer to that is that I hope that people will be apprised of or reminded, if it's something they once knew and forgot, of the importance of engaging as much of the world as possible rather than closing a lot of it out, and that the advantage of knowing more about the world and trying to engage it is that it's less likely to come and hit you in ways that you don't expect. So the notion of education, of expansion, of what I call cosmopolitanism seems to me to be something that needs to be broadcast and put out there. I would say also that that I hope that people will appreciate the varieties of religion in the United States and the variety of relationships that it has with public affairs. But I'm not sure that well, you're asking me. Well, okay. I'll add one other thing. I believe that one of the classic and insufficiently analyzed dimensions of modern life is this tension between the will to include and the will to define. And I believe that the history of Protestantism is a signal example of how difficult that tension can be. So I hope that my readers would understand that as a generic problem. And that applies not only to Protestantism and all my examples of how the more they tried to broaden it, the harder time they had to describe what it was. But if they said exactly what it was hard to include a lot of people. And that's generic for talking about the general reader. Solidarities that are global in scope might be capable of dealing with global warming, but solidarities that are that large in scope are not able to provide intimacy and belonging. So if people need a community that provides intimacy and belonging, they will close in and are less likely to want to take into account global dynamics. So I'm saying that this is something that is always there, and I don't think we have very many books that deal with it very effectively, and it's not something that there's a formulaic answer to. But I wanted my book to cite an important example and show the difficulty of it, the difficulty all the way to the end of, how is this problem solved? So when I say that these people understood that Cain's answer was not theirs, that doesn't mean that Cain's answer is easily implemented.
Tom?
Tom Gesellman from the University of Notre Dame. I have a question about the religious dimension of your subjects, because you show us in their post-Protestant mode, but I'm curious if you can say anything about how they moved from Protestant to post-Protestant. Was it an adolescence? Was it involving generational conflict with parents? Was it a struggle for them? Did it happen easily? How did this process happen inside the minds and religious sensibilities of your subjects? So that's one dimension of the question. And I wonder if Houston Smith doesn't provide an interesting, and maybe Hutchinson as well, interesting cases of people who, as they took their missionary experience, retained a religious sensibility and reflected on it in a theological dimension. Is there a way in which this group of people had an impact on the overall openingness to Oriental religions and Asian religions in the last half of the 20th century that's apart from their influence on public policy?
I think the best answer to that is to specify at first where people begin. And if you begin with a very parochial understanding of the world, and you really don't know much about Japan or China or India, and you know your Bible pretty well, but then you go to these places and you find a lot of things that don't quite fit in. Does your understanding of the Bible provide an opportunity to engage the complexity and the entirety of traditional Japanese culture? Well, Edwin Reischauer's dad decided it did not, so he began writing books about Buddhism. So there's a matter of engagement with parts of human life that were just not there before, that have what we can loosely call a liberalizing effect. So the contact with other stuff, that's why I keep talking about at the end of the book about contact theory, about demographic diversification as something that promotes this. But I wouldn't want to underestimate the other thing I keep harping on, cognitive demystification, and that is the education about what modern science teaches us about the world. A number of the people that I study in this book were turned, and perhaps Kenneth Landon is the most interesting example, were turned by extensive conversation with scientifically oriented freethinkers. So when Landon gets to the University of Chicago, he's defending Calvinist ideas. He knows they're true. However, he's been sort of secretly unnerved by his experiences in Thailand, the experience of what I'm calling demographic diversity, dealing with different kinds of people. So he comes back then to Chicago after his first experience in Thailand, and he's studying with these free-thinking philosophers at the University of Chicago, and they turn him. Now, he keeps this a secret from the wife, who's a really smart, interesting person. Margaret Landon deserves a lot of scholarly attention. But then he reveals this to her in this fascinating handwritten letter that I found in the Wheaton archives in 1942, where he describes that it was the secular humanists at the University of Chicago that deprived him of his faith. Now, when you go to some of the efforts to summarize the missionary experience, you go to John Hersey's great novel, The Call. Okay, there you have a similar dynamic where the hero gradually loses all but a few broken shards of his faith as a result of his ongoing interaction with a British doctor who has him read Kant and Hegel and all that sort of thing. So I think that education in aspects of the whole Western canon has a lot to do with it, based also on diverse experience. So there's a combination, I would say, of demographic diversification, including by long distance through these missionaries, and cognitive demystification through the forward march of the Enlightenment, for lack of a better term. These things make a big difference. The studies of of a lot of these evangelical churches in the United States, I recently read a wonderful one of a bunch of evangelical churches in the Seattle area, that the preachers are almost all graduates of Bible institutes, okay? These are not people that went to the Pacific School of Religion or even Fuller. And so there is an educational cultural matrix for these changes that seems to me to be very important. At least I try to give an example of that.
David, you've said several times you were interested to hear the Catholic dimensions of this conversation, so I'll take you at your word at that and just ask a question about, last week we had rolling through South Bend, the nuns on the bus, led by Sister Simone Campbell, on the way to Mar-a-Lago, where they're protesting various things, a cross-country bus trip. And when you talked about the women that you wrote about, having more effect on the transformation of ecclesiastical institutions than public institutions, I wonder if we could think, and this is a question I'd like to hear Marie's views on as well, Catholic sisters might be an example of a group of religious women that had more influence on the public discussions than they did on their own ecclesiastical structures. And I say that, so Simone Campbell entered religious life in 1966, which was being transformed certainly by the Second Vatican Council, but also by the return of many Catholic sisters who had been serving as missionaries in developing countries. And were doing much of what you write about, the boomerang effect. And they didn't have missionary kids per se, but they had missionary family members in the people that were members of the religious communities back home. So I wonder if that might be one angle in which Catholics might fit in and challenge your argument, at least on women, a little bit.
Yes.
Marie, you've written a lot about religion and feminism and how they developed and the perception that they're antithetical, but anyway, so I'd love to.
I think it's a lovely question, and I'd love for you to write about that. Or for someone, you're done with your current book, just about?
Well, I have a doctoral student who's writing about that. Jill Plummer is writing about that. So
that's great. Yeah, I think that's true, and I can think of other women out there, like even a Frances Kissling or something, who was for many years the head of Catholics for Free Choice or Catholics for Choice. Well, how much impact did she really have on Catholics themselves, still church-going Catholics and their views on abortion, but in terms of like the wider kind of feminist world, great impact. So I think, and Simone Campbell's probably another great example of that, so I like that point a lot. Yes?
I'm an Africanist, so I appreciated the absence of Africa from the book, since it's not as significant for American contributions to the way the U.S. incorporated Africa. But I'm interested in Latin America and some of the evidence you might have uncovered about whether missionary kids would have affected U.S. approaches to Latin America more generally in the Cold War era. And I don't know the answer. A second question has to do with the history of Title VI funding. The area studies funding that created universities that had particular area foci. It seems to me, and Fulbright-Hays funding also, I don't know the extent to which missionary kids would have been part of those two stories.
The matter of Africa was affected by
that Africa was not a major theater during World War II. And as a result, the missionaries in Africa were not brought into the OSS and the State Department the way they were from Japan and China and India and a lot of other places. So as a result, when I was looking for cases of where this missionary people came into the big institutions I was studying, there were very few from Africa, partly because it was much later that the United States decided it had strategic significance, and so it didn't play that much of a role. Also, when you learn these languages, and many of the missionaries in Africa did magnificent language work, as Laman Samuth and others have pointed out. It's not very portable. See, whereas if you learn Chinese or Arabic, that's something that is marketable in all sorts of public spheres. So that the investment in the language, which is so important to the story that I tell in the book, doesn't have an African dimension to nearly the same extent. Another thing is that the missionaries that went to Africa, even though eventually many of them became deeply aware and appreciative of many aspects of African history, to begin with, this was a big contrast with India, China, Japan, and the Arab societies in terms of a development of a classical civilization. So the people that I'm studying, when they go to the countries that have a classical civilization, they're really bowled over by this, and many of them decide that they want to study those kinds of societies. So the Africa is not in the book for those reasons. It's just not as much there. I remember writing to the leaders of the African Studies Association about this, and they told me, no, forget it. Latin America is a little bit different because the United States was in Latin America all along. There's the Monroe Doctrine and all that stuff. And also Spanish is something that was widely used in the United States, in educated and relatively uneducated circles. So the impetus to get my cast of characters involved in the public sphere was less in the case of Latin America. Now, I found a few cases that I talk about here and there, so there are a few. But the other thing to remember is that the Latin American mission field, with some very significant exceptions, drew a more conservative type of missionary. Many of the ecumenical missionaries were more respectful of Catholicism. So they didn't want to go in and horn in on Catholic territory. The more conservative and more evangelical missionaries were less bothered by that. And it's significant that this really important book by Edwin Soper in 1943 on the philosophy of the world mission, he's just can't deal with the Latin America question. So he does it not in the process of his own analysis, but he has a whole appendix on it. He deals with it as a separate question. And the big thing is, what do you do with the Catholics? And he's saying, well, we sort of want to get along with them, but they don't care about us, and they don't care about liberty and about freedom of inquiry and so forth. And so that's why it's okay if some people want to go down there. Now, all that said, there are a couple of fantastically important examples. Richard Schau, who writes this Encounter with Revolution. This guy was a tremendously important figure in American Protestantism during the 1950s. And that book was used at any number of these youth conferences. And if we want to talk about the Cold War, this is not Cold War politics. This is a guy who's trying to mobilize the Protestant young people in America on behalf of revolution throughout the world against the West. So it's not that there's not a Latin American story there. Now, I didn't find an awful lot of it. And it may be that there's more State Department missionary influence than I'm aware of. So I would identify that as one of the areas where I'm the least confident about what I've written and the most eager to see other people take it up.
Peter Tucson, IUPUI, you may have just addressed the thing I wanted to raise, but I'll jump in on it anyway, and that is that if you'll indulge a little bit of a personal anecdote, my father-in-law and mother-in-law were missionaries from the 50s to the 70s in Latin America and Costa Rica. They had 6 kids, all learned to speak Spanish fluently, and came back and were engaged in the kinds of careers that you described here. They were more conservative. They weren't, they kind of straddled the mainline evangelical divide, but they leaned evangelical, and they went with an evangelical organization. But what I was struck by, you mentioned Soper, how he puts Protestant, or Latin America in an appendix. And it's that difficulty that I think a lot of Protestant missionaries had with how to deal with Catholicism, but especially in the Latin America context. What strikes me about my wife's family's experience is, I think it made them much friendlier toward Catholicism, despite their having gone over there with, I think, pretty anti-Catholic attitudes. One of the 6 kids converted to Catholicism later. My wife's parents came back and, I think, turned to a lot of Catholic authors in their reading, novelists, theologians. And so, I mean, did you find evidence of that, of friendliness toward Catholicism as an intellectual universe among even more evangelical-leaning missionaries? I mean, and one more thing, I mean, while they were over there, of course, 50s to the 70s, Vatican II happened, the U.S. elected its first Catholic president, so there were things happening elsewhere that would have affected this friendlier attitude toward Catholicism too.
I think chronology is really crucial in addressing this, Peter, so I agree with that. The ecumenical Protestant establishment was really pretty virulently anti-Catholic all the way down to 1960, 62, and there's a big change then. Now, there are, interesting and famous exceptions. I mean, Reinhold Niebuhr is going out of his way as early as the 1940s to develop cordial relations with Protestants. Martin has a big following in the United States. But I guess my answer to your question is that you do see exactly what you're talking about by the 1970s, by which time not only the public image of Catholicism, but as I understand it, and I'm sure there are people here who know more about this than I do, but the practice of the Catholic leaders in Latin America, I think, had changed by the end of the 1970s. So when Soper is, or for that matter, even when Shaw is angry at the Catholics in 1955, he has a series of examples of where the Catholic hierarchy is, standing four-square with these dictators, and this is seen as part and parcel of Vichy governments, the Catholic support for Vichy. So the notion that Catholics were basically fascists is quite widespread on a sort of colloquial level among not only rank and file ecumenical Protestants, but the leadership as well for quite a long time. Now, Vatican II has a huge impact on these people. I mean, I refer a couple times to this fellow Lindbeck, a missionary child who was the chief Lutheran observer at Vatican II. So this comes back. Martin Marty, who we mentioned a while ago, he writes an amazing editorial for the Christian Century in 1960, in which he, speaking grandly for the Protestants, dead, living, and unborn, so to speak, says, look, we got to accept the Catholics. We've even got to accept the atheists and all these other people. And the days of Protestant cultural hegemony are just over. So in the process of that change, and there's quite a lot of stuff from 1960 to 1965 in the Christian Century and other ecumenical Protestant that move in that direction. Now, I don't see as much of it in Christianity today. I don't know Christianity today as well, but the efforts that I have made to look at it indicate that they were maybe 8 or 10 years behind if you're going to say they're doing the same things. You probably know more about that than I do.
Not necessarily.
Jay?
I'm Jay Malone. I'm the director of the History of Science Society based here at Notre Dame. Many people may not know that David gave the distinguished lecture for the History of Science Society back in 1994. And so you may be uniquely qualified to answer this question. I was raised in Mississippi, and my mother was the director of the Women's Missionary Union, the largest Baptist church in Mississippi.
Wonderful.
And so Lottie Moon, Christmas Offering, and internationals were a part of my life. This idea of engagement, of how do we approach individuals, and I like what you had to say about this, when their belief system is hard to penetrate. And when we teach the history of evolution to Christian students, we have to be sensitive to that belief system and not ignore it or not ridicule it, but try to understand it. So I was wondering what type of advice or strategies you would give us to go to individuals and tell them, in effect, become missionaries to the missionaries about this cognitive demystification. I'm not sure if that's something that would trip over their tongues, but how do we engage these populations?
I wish I had a better answer to that than I do. I think one possible point of entry to that whole domain of challenges in terms of cultural conflict and politics, one possible point of entry is the evangelical clergy. And I've been interested during the last year or so at the number of columns by Michael Gerson in the Post and John Fay at Messiah College, a number of other people who sort of identify with an evangelical Protestant tradition that are appalled at what's going on in the country and at the propensity of so many evangelical leaders to line up with Trump and his whole administration. Now, this conversation on the part of a lot of evangelical identified intellectuals who are critical of Trump, this conversation, so far as I can see, is carried out by the most educated subset of the evangelical leadership. And I think it includes, who's this fellow that runs Sojourners, Jim Wallace. It includes even, there's Rich Mao, the former president of Fuller. So there are a group of people out there that I think, to push to where your question leads, these people have credibility in creating openings and more of a conversation. I mean, these are people who can really argue Romans. Now, if I tell some evangelical opponent of same-sex relationships that I have a daughter in a same-sex marriage, that my wife has spent many years on the National Board of Planned Parenthood, and that I've been a flaming atheist for 50 years. And in that context, I think that they should think differently than they do. Good luck. So, I mean, I'm in favor of open conversations of many parties, but I think that the educated evangelical clergy has a unique opportunity now to reach a lot of the public and this sort of reaching out. Now, I would do it in realms where I think that I have credibility and where I can establish some kind of genuinely fraternal relationship, but I don't want to pretend that. And I think that many of the people who just are so dug in with everything that Sean Hannity has to say on Fox, and that they go to their evangelical church and their preacher doesn't challenge them on this. These are folks that could be challenged by an educated evangelical clergy. The most poignant thing that I read on this in the Times here about 6 or 8 weeks ago was a story about an evangelical preacher in Alabama. And it was the narrative of his decision. He's going to go into this congregation, and he knows that they all have a lot of ideas that he thinks are wrong and are very dangerous for the country. And he has to decide what he's going to do about this, because he knows that they're not going to like what he really wants to say to them. And he knows that his job is a question, and this whole network of people that support him. And when he goes into the church, he decides not to say it. Okay. Now, as an outsider, I wish he would have said it. I wish that he would have gone ahead. So I think that the evangelical clergy is uniquely qualified to make this entry. I also think that ecumenical Protestants have a chance to be more outspoken. And I see some signs of this, although it's a very hard time to get the press to pay any attention to what ecumenical Protestants have to say. But I think that there's also a point there. So I guess what I would see is that each of us, within whatever domains we have, and however much they overlap with others, push as hard as we can right now. It's a very dangerous time in the country, and we shouldn't pretend to be able to speak to people who aren't going to listen to us, but when you find somebody who can, you should do it. I wish I had a better answer to that. It's the best I can do.
Can I
That
add
was
a
a pretty
word?
good answer, but
Can I
please.
just want to add a word too, because it seems to me, yeah, that you answered the question, you answered your own question when you talked about your own background coming out of Mississippi and Southern Baptist circles. I am always amazed at how many ex-Southern Baptists populate our field. But by ex, I shouldn't say ex, I would say post, in the way that, to get back to Daryl's question, who were deeply, deeply shaped by dimensions of that history and continue to feel profoundly shaped by that and don't have simple identities or simple relationships to religion. And I find, in engaging with students, that sort of the personal side for me of that history is a really helpful bridge, across different things. And so anyway, everything you said and this
I want to add
personal
that
history.
on the matter of optimism or pessimism, which came up earlier, the strongest source of my pessimism is the number of friends I have whose sibling or son or parent is just adamant for Fox News and Trump. So here are all these Berkeley intellectuals, and they have no rapport at all with other members of their own family, people who are shaped in the same kind of way. The other day, at one of my grandchildren's soccer game, I talked to this woman from Texas. This is a Hispanic woman, about 45, and she just recently moved to California from Texas. So I started talking about the Cruz candidacy down in the Senate race. And pretty soon she began talking about her own family. These are Hispanics, God save the mark. And she said that all of her families, all of her parents, all of her husband's family were all adamant Trump supporters. And that they thought that all these people coming across the border were despicable, and it's a good thing that Trump was going to put up a wall to keep them out. Okay, does that represent Hispanics in Texas? Of course not. But yet, that's part of it. So when you have families that come out of the same cultural milieu and often the same religious culture, and you can't break through there, this is, I think, a sign of how deep this problem is, and why, even though we've given our best answers to this, it's not easy.
We have questions from Heather and then John, and I'll just say briefly that you mentioned John Fia, and following John's blog, and he's a friend and former colleague of mine, he's currently on a book tour on evangelicals in the age of Trump, and one of the funny things, I guess, about reading his blog is how many members of the audience come to the talk without reading the book jacket and are surprised. They're expecting a pro-Trump talk and then find an anti-Trump talk. I think that just happened at Valparaiso a couple weeks ago. So I'm keeping a list. Heather, please, and then John, and just flag me if you have a question.
So I'm Heather Curtis from Tufts, and I just want, yes, so thank
So I made
you.
this wisecrack about your book.
No, you didn't. Don't worry. So I just want to say, one of the things that's been great about the conversation is all of the conversations it's opening up, things that are left out, and but picking up on Marie's point, one of the things I've been thinking throughout is how many religious studies departments, we have a joke that religious studies departments are populated by post-evangelicals and also people who have continued to maintain an affiliation to a religious tradition. So it got me thinking about if one of the areas that needs further exploration is cosmopolitanism in evangelicalism. If there's an issue of chronology, because even your mention of Jim Wallace, there's been some really good work over the last 10 years on the evangelical left. And looking at the 60s, we're also dominated by a historiography and a conversation that focuses on the evangelical right. But Melanie's book, David Swartz, David Kirkpatrick has a book coming out that looks at Latin American evangelicalism, but from the perspective of evangelicals in Latin America who challenged the conservative evangelicalism here. So I think, I'm just wondering if maybe the story about evangelicals, somebody writing a book now would look different if they were looking not at the mid-century or my period where there was, up to 1910, a debate about cosmopolitanism and not.
Right.
So to just fill out and complexify that story, the last anecdote that I'll give is what I was invited to give a talk about my book at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And before the talk and at the talk, it was a lot of people who work in the State Department for USAID, for contemporary, for World Vision, and the USAID folks that came to my talk were all self-identified evangelicals. So, I mean, so this is the thing, that there are now people that are in places that you're identifying as the public sphere. And some of them, I think David King also's book is going to come out on World Vision, and he's got great anecdotes of the kind of self-reflection in that organization. But at the same time, there's also people who don't have a cosmopolitan view, right? And they're also in positions of power within the state that are not wouldn't be reflective of the evangelical progressivism. So I'll stop there.
Everything you say is very interesting. About cosmopolitanism, I think it's sometimes helpful to think of it as applying to, among other things, a belief that you have something to learn from others. So cosmopolitanism is not just like traveling around the world or getting to know other kinds of folks, but the people that I'm calling missionary cosmopolitans think that they got something to learn from Asia, and so they bring that in, and that's not all cosmopolitans display that additional dimension. But I'm struck by your comment about the religious demography of the people that you're referring to, and I can't resist an anecdote of my own, which our colleague in the History of Science will appreciate. The year after I gave the distinguished lecture for the History of Science Society, I was at a meeting after, I guess, the executive committee, and this was a bunch of us were having a beer, and it was the president of the History of Science Society, the president-elect of the History of Science Society, the editor of the journal, and the executive director, those four, and myself as the distinguished lecturer. All five of these people in 1994 had grown up in families where alcohol, dancing, cigarettes, and card playing were prohibited. And this was in the History of Science Society. So, and these include Ron Numbers, whom some of you will know. So there's a, how the demography of some of these academic groups, as well as public groups, is formed. Now, in this case, when we discovered that this was true about all ourselves, everybody began talking about their own biographies and so forth, and everybody had been struck from a very early age on the science-religion controversy. And so this kind of stuff was part of the evolution of these four people. So I think that your point about evangelicals in a lot of these other settings is very striking. I'm also struck with Marie's comment about the number of post-Southern Baptists that you run across. And I find when I go around doing talks like this, I remember I did one in Washington a couple years ago, and I think there were half a dozen people come up afterward, and the conversation is always, well, you know, I used to be an evangelical. And then, you know, something else happened. So dynamism occurs in many contexts.
So you were having a beer with this group of
I'm
people.
afraid
Were
so.
you also dancing and playing cards at the same time? Were you just going for all of it?
I've never been a good dancer. That's something that was just coded in the German Baptist Brethren didn't approve.
John?
Thanks to the panelists and to David for a great book. I take the books to be an important contribution, and you emphasize this as well, to American history. That you're very explicit. I'm not trying to make a contribution to Chinese history. This is a book about American history. But if you could step back for a second and try and connect two phenomena. One is the phenomenon you write about, which is the meaning of the missionary experience for American history and the opening up that experience allowed. And the second is the explosion in global Christianity at exactly the same moment, which if you were to be a global historian, you'd say that's the big topic that we need lots of research on and lots of reflection on. But you're resistant, if I read the book correctly, to almost any connection between the American history story and the global story. I just want to give you one quote from the book. I wonder if, this is a direct quote, Christianity in the global South is really part of a single community of faith with the Protestants of the North Atlantic West. I wonder if that's right. In other words, can we really segment the American story that you're telling from the big picture global history story of the explosion of Christianity in the global South in the 20th century? And what is it that makes you so resistant to drawing that connection?
I think the connection is there, and you're right. And the book actually tries to gesture in that direction, but doesn't do as much as it should. And the reason that I was so reluctant is that I did not want people to think that I was claiming to write about the missionary project as such. And I was overwhelmingly struck again and again in my research about how many really interesting questions there are in missionary research that are not actually done even by the people that are in that now. So I got very interested in that, but also highly sensitive to the questions that you're asking. What question are you really asking? So the question I'm asking about public life of the United States, but it is interactive, and I'll give you an example of where I think a lot of our colleagues in the mainstream history profession that I'm a part of have been slow to pick up. When I wrote to some of my friends in the field of American women's history about Pearl Buck, and one of them, again, I won't name this person, very prominent scholar, not the one who was a Trotskyist, but a different one. And she writes me back and says...
You know, we could invoke the seal of the confession. You are
We
in a
could.
Catholic audience.
Right.
I mean, you can name these names and we want...
I'll
Just
try
kidding,
that.
just kidding.
Anyway,
Just
this
kidding.
woman says, oh, Pearl Buck, well, we, speaking corporately, we, the American women's history profession of the last 40 years, she says, we thought of her as, oh, you know, that was about China, okay? Whereas I'm trying to say that the dialectic here, and that America is really partly formed by all this interaction abroad. And the thing about, I mean, and there's a gender dimension to this, when we do American diplomatic history, as Bill and others here know, we talk about the lives of American men abroad as part of American history. Okay, but when we talk about women, you know, that's not part of American history. So 2/3 of all the missionary personnel were females. And this applies throughout the different mission fields. And I kept coming across all these amazing stories about these missionary women, missionary wives, some single, some part of these couples. And I read their memoirs, read a lot of their correspondence. And there's not much on this. What we have on women and missionaries is almost exclusively pre-1920. But a lot of the action is after 1920, when a lot of these women are like presidents of colleges and stuff like that, very, very prominent. So there's an interaction. There are women's lives abroad that ought to be understood as a part of American history. But that's part of the larger thing, that what all Americans do abroad ought to be part of American history. And missionaries, I would say, have been uniquely left out. That missionaries, because it is sometimes said, as was once said to me when I started working on this project, white Protestants can't do anything except experience white privilege. Well, yeah, that's true, but the privilege that they used was deployed very differently. So not every white Protestant used the privilege they had in quite the same way. So I'm totally on your side about that, on the general thing. Now, you followed that with a specific example, or was there
I'm not sure we are on the same side, because I'm saying...
Oh, I know what it was. Let me interrupt myself to pick up.
Well, let me interrupt you, but I'm saying...
Global South.
Could you have done more to connect
Yeah.
your very important,
Yeah.
completely compelling
Right.
story of American history to this enormous global history
Yeah.
story
Yeah.
of the explosion of Christianity? I think
Yeah.
you're resistant to
Yeah,
that.
I am.
And why is that?
Yeah. In fact, this is such an interesting question, John, that particular sentence, that a lot of people called me on that. So much so that I've just published an article on the topic, which I will send to you, called Christianity, the Global South and Secularization. It's a review of the new Brian Stanley book on world Christianity. And there I try to explore this problem more fully. And there's it pivots on a great sentence that Brian uses at the end, and I'm not sure how self-aware he was when he writes this sentence. He says, the big question is whether or not Christianity has spread into the global south, or whether alien agents have conquered Christianity, okay? Now, he's very careful that he does not want to come across as a racist, okay? So instead of talking about witch doctors in the Congo, okay, he talks about American prosperity gospel and the individualism of a lot of American religion. So my point of entry into this is when Sarah Palin was blessed in her own evangelical church in Alaska by a Kenyan bishop who hoped that the witches would not get to her. So I'm saying that if Christianity is so inclusive that we're going to include the witch-respecting, homophobic, polygamous aspects of African Christianity, as well as the other stuff, which is not that way, that creates a question as to what the boundaries of Christianity are. I'm also sensitive to this as it plays into the secularization debates. Oh, secularization isn't happening. Just look at the global south. Really? I would argue that classic secularization theory predicts the decline of religion in the West and the rise of the religion in the South on classic grounds: education, scientific literacy, democratic political institutions, a whole variety of things that Weber and Durkheim and all these people talked about still seem to me to be true. So the article is a way of explaining why I'm resistant to it. Now, that also includes interpretation of the Pentecostals. Where are the Pentecostals? Okay, there's some very well-educated Pentecostals, but a lot of them really are not. So the question of whether or not the leaders of the informal polity of Christianity made the right decision when they welcomed Pentecostals in. Calvin, remember, had no use for speaking in tongues. That's again this inclusion question. We're going to include the Pentecostals. We're going to include the polygamous bishops of Kenya. I mean, after all, it's one big happy Christian family, right? Well, I wonder.
Okay. Please.
Don Lydens from Hope College. It's fascinating to me to hear the forest being talked about, because I'm working with a couple of trees. In my retirement, I'm writing a book on my parents who were missionaries in the 40s and 50s in the Middle East. And I'm struck by a couple of comments here, one in response to you, to an earlier statement, question here about the transformation. My parents were very evangelical when they went out. My mother was convinced that if she just showed what love was, everything would flow quickly. Some of her letters show some remarkable insights. Success was the beginning of change. Let me give you an example. Converts from Islam to Christianity presented a huge problem to missionaries, to the point where they often, in the Reformed Church's mission world, would push potential converts away and say, are you really sure you want to do this? This is going to cost you. This is a difficult thing. Be real sure that you are going to make affirmations that you want. And for my mother, it became a real issue, because if a woman converted, especially a single woman converted, she was quickly swept up into marriage, sent off to another community, and disappeared from public view and from my mother's contact with her. So she begins to say to herself, is this cost of conversion so serious that I couldn't do it myself? That's when the change begins for her. She's asking, is this something that I could go through if it was a reverse situation? And clearly her answer, although she doesn't say it, is no. The other component of her proto-feminism, she doesn't articulate it this way, and it wasn't for another 30 years before she saw herself as in the vanguard to some extent. She goes into the harem, she goes into the harems where the middle class and upper middle class women are in sanctuary. This is their place. where they can take their hoods down and they can talk to each other. And what strikes her as troubling is that she is the messenger of the world to them. As soon as she hits the harem, everybody wants to know what's going on out there. What's the politics? What's happening on the street? Give us some idea. And always, did your husband let you come here? And it's getting late. Don't you think you need to go home? Do you have to tell him that you're still here? And not, in a sense, not realizing the quality of that, she is telling them there is a different world potential for you outside, to the point where she begins to say to herself, am I presenting a world to them that is impossible for them to experience? And therefore, when they hear me talk about, yes, this is what other women are doing as nurses, as doctors, as teachers, we can move around freely, we don't have to ask our husbands' permissions to leave the house. She's seeing that as tremendously undermining their culture. And is it right for her to do that? That begins to be a real serious question for her. Now, again, I apologize.
And she has these letters, but she hasn't written a memoir, or she written?
No, she just wrote these letters to her parents, and that's what I'm reading through.
Well, I wish somebody would read a lot more of those sources. I found a lot of letters from missionary women, especially along those lines, and there's some memoirs. John Service's mother wrote a fantastic memoir about China called Golden Inches, and the self-reflection about the cultural project of the missionary thing intersperses with all these sort of American frontier woman experiences. You know, she has a child that dies in her arms while she's trying to make it back to her house. I mean, a whole variety of them. There, bandits are coming around. I mean, these are women that held together families under really quite remarkable circumstances. And so the Lottie Moon example can be pushed out in a whole lot of other ways where people had a very different spiritual orientation. So I'm glad to know that you're working on this, and I hope that you're able to publish them.
You know, what's fun for me is to hear the forest that you talked about, the local experience, because I'm looking very much at their very personal, very immediate.
Yeah, but I tried to put in these chapters lots of trees too. You know, I think Margaret Landon is a tree.
She's a fascinating tree. Do we have a question from the back?
I'm Ian Van Dyke. I'm a PhD student here at Notre Dame. I'm interested in the story that happens after your book. So the story you tell is of a cosmopolitanism that is shaped by liberal and ecumenical Protestants that becomes really influential in the academy, in the government, etc. I think you're right about evangelical Protestants and maybe also Catholics sort of being latecomers to a kind of multicultural project. But I'm wondering if what happens after the end of your book, the emergence of growing alliances between conservative Protestants and conservative Catholics, the inclusion of Russian Orthodox conservatives after the fall of the Soviet Union in conversations, maybe if that changes cosmopolitanism, or if these people don't fit into your story. In other words, is cosmopolitanism a liberal project alone, or is it also a project with implications for conservatism in the later parts of the 20th century?
I don't know exactly how to interpret a lot of these things of the last 40 or 50 years. I'm less confident about that than I am about the earlier story. I have difficulty envisioning the ideal of cosmopolitanism without its being understood as classically liberal in some way. Now, that's not to say that people who have conservative politics or conservative theology are oblivious to what's going on around the rest of the world. I don't mean to attribute ignorance to all such people. I'm just saying that as a historical reality, the cosmopolitan ideal of trying to take as much of the world into account as you can and still retain the capacity to function as a person or a group, if that's the classical cosmopolitan ideal, that has generally been enunciated by people who gravitate toward liberal projects religiously and in politics. So I wouldn't I wouldn't want to make too sharp a boundary there, but I do want to recognize that that's the mainstream of how that concept has developed. As to the reallocation, the realignments of things since that time, it's true that when the ecumenical Protestants decide that a lot of traditional ideas about gender, about sexuality, about divinity, about biblical warrant, about supernaturalism, about race, when the liberal establishment that writes for the Christian Century and teaches at the Harvard Div School and Union and so forth, when these people decide that those ideas are no longer tenable, okay, then they move away from them, and a less educated populace is told by Billy Graham and others that the old ideas are still okay. So the seismic shift that I talk about in After Cloven Tongues of Fire, I still think is true as far as it goes. Now, that's not the only thing that's happening in the United States, and there are all sorts of aspects of political economy and that affect the way things go. But I think the best answer that I would have to your question is that I see many of the people that I call post-Protestant secularists as perpetuating the tradition that a lot of these people enunciate in the book. But again, where it's all going to end up, I'm not sure.
We have a question from Bob, but it looks like, Father Bill, do you have a comment on this point? No? Okay.
Back to John McGreevy's point about the global south.
Okay.
David, I found your comments extremely dismissive about Christianity in the global south in response to John, the dismissal of, polygamous bishops, etc., etc. Now, I visited my brother over a period of 20 years in Southeast Asia, so I'm defining that as my experience. Devout people, deeply committed to their faith, and in fact, some of them moving my own home country, Australia, they're going to keep Christianity alive in Australia, these people. And the notion that they can just be sort of swept aside in the dismissive way that you did in response to John McGreevy's question, I find
Then let me try this. Let me see.
Deeply troubling.
Let me try
They
this.
are going to sustain Christianity. And by the way, getting back to China, look at all those Christians in China who evangelical Protestants are helping today in the house churches, despite the persecution of the Chinese government. Christianity is living in these places, and you have to put it down to a deep religious motive. It's not ignorance. They believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior. That's what sustains them.
What about Philip Jenkins's idea of the third church? As I understand Jenkins, and I believe that Stanley goes along with this as well, we need to understand three Christian churches. One is the Roman Church. The second is the panorama of religious fellowships authorized by the Protestant Reformation. The third is an African-centered church which has a really different culture, Jenkins says, and Stanley too, from either of these other two churches.
Where do African Catholics fit in this?
African Catholics, you know more about them than I. I wouldn't be surprised, but what Jenkins would include them in what he calls the third church. Maybe not. I haven't quizzed him on that. But what I'm getting at is, and this is what this essay that I mentioned earlier about Stanley talks about. What I'm getting at is the difference between treating the third church as an autonomous project that shall go forward and be honored with its dignity in the same way as the first church and the second church, the distinction between doing that on the one hand, and on the second hand, weaponizing the third church in the global south to attack liberals and secularists in the North Atlantic West. And there's a lot of that. So when you have an argument that secularization isn't happening because of all this that's going on in the global south, I'm saying that classical secularization theory is still true, which doesn't mean that we lack respect and understanding for the third church. I think that Jenkins comes right to the edge, and also Stanley comes right to the edge of promoting more autonomy for what they call the third church. I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
it's not completely convincing because you're ignoring the deep religious motivations of these people that are shared across the churches. They all believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, you see.
Right, we're getting very close to the end of our formal time together. I know Bob has been waiting to ask a question, and I do want to give, and I know Ken, and I do want to give our panelists, if they choose, a chance to make a final comment. So if you could keep your questions brief and try to keep the answers brief, recognizing that's very difficult to do. Bob, please.
Thank you. I'm Bob Johansen, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Peace Studies here at Notre Dame. Thank you very much for the panelists and David for your book and comments. I want to return to a little more discussion about the cosmopolitanism question. You've told us a little bit about what that means, but I wonder if you could say more about the content of the cosmopolitanism that's associated with this missionary tradition, and if it is the same thread of intellectual development that has been sort of the globalization stream that has triggered populism so much in the United States, or is the content somewhat different? And in terms of, as a political scientist, cosmopolitanism mainly has to address the question that you talked about in terms of belonging and intimacy, that is, nationalism. What is the perspective of this cosmopolitanism on nationalism and the role of nationalism or its impediments to building truly cosmopolitan institutions internationally that may enable us to address things like war, like global warming, and so on? Because this tension that you pointed to between inclusivity and having an association of intimacy and belonging is very much present in this populist sort of growth, because they are accurately reflecting the incongruity between national institutions and solving global problems.
The great cosmopolitan Herbert Marcuse used to say, the only good thing that ever came out of the East was the sun. Now, I use that as an example of an extreme example of the Eurocentric character of Jewish cosmopolitanism, as I talk about it in this book and elsewhere as a major presence in American life in the middle decades of the 20th century. When I talk about missionary cosmopolitanism, I'm arguing that at the same time that Jewish cosmopolitanism makes American public life much more responsive to things European, missionary cosmopolitanism makes American public life much more responsive to things that are Asian. Now, both of these styles of cosmopolitanism embody this desire to reach out and take into account more things, but the substance of what they provide is very different. So I think that one of the great significances historically of missionary cosmopolitanism is that it attracts more attention and more sympathetic attention, especially to things that are going on in Asia. So I see the two kinds of cosmopolitanisms as developing coterminously. Several people have pointed out that if I were to elaborate on this a little bit more, I should point out that the missionary cosmopolitans were irredeemably earnest. And the Jewish cosmopolitans had a sense of irony. And so that you had Jewish cosmopolitans talking about Kafka and Dostoevsky, while the missionary cosmopolitans were very straight. And I think that's true, that even somebody like John Hersey was, from a point of view of the Partisan Review, very middlebrow. So there's a difference in style. You might say that the Jewish cosmopolitans were into authenticity and the missionary cosmopolitans were into sincerity in the Lionel Trilling dichotomy. The question about populism, I'm not quite sure what to do with that, because most of what we now call populism is anti-cosmopolitan, it seems to me, at least as I read what the pundits say about that the populists are people who think you don't need a lot of all this expertise, and these people that fly around the world and engage other cultures, that populism, as it's now being depicted usually, is more of a nativist kind of thing. So I would see cosmopolitanism as the opposite. I would see most populisms as a form of provincialism, of parochialism. And so this standard tension between, trying to include everybody and trying to get something that's comfortable and provides intimacy and belonging. So I guess that's, the examples that you've given are somewhere along this spectrum of welcoming everybody and welcoming just yourself. It's the best I can do on that.
All right, our final question, Ken?
Yeah, I'm Ken Woodward. I worked at Newsweek for a lot of years. But today I want to channel Grant Wacker, since he can't be here. You don't say much about Billy Graham, and what you do say is not terribly positive in your book. But I wonder if you might think about this as we've been talking about the present. Billy, as I understand him, and I think as Grant presents him, basically took the word of salvation to other people and didn't listen to what indigenous populations might have offered in return. This changed somewhat when he went to Eastern Europe, where he saw Christians he felt were more authentically Christian than the ones he had come from. But my question goes to this: when he decides to pass on his baton, he really doesn't give it to the son. He gives it to the barefoot evangelists at these world globalization conferences that he created. I happen to think that was a very inventive move on his part. And these barefoot evangelists are indigenous people who are preaching the gospel and evangelizing. So my question to you is, and I realize it takes well out of the frame of your book, but isn't it possible that this kind of experience and the relying on these indigenous people might in fact make evangelicals, or might already be making the very conservative evangelicals more cosmopolitan in your missionary sense?
Yeah, I hope so. And I've discussed this with Grant Walker many times. And I wrote a long review of his book in the Christian Century, and so he and I have a conversation on exactly these points. I think that your suggestion that interaction with all these different kinds of people can have an opening up effect, a liberalizing effect, a deprovincializing effect, I think that's right. And I think the example that you gave of Graham himself is a credible one. What we need to remember, though, is that Graham's entire career enabled exactly what his son has done. So I strongly resist Grant's interpretation and argued in my review that his book is diametrically opposed in its evidence to what its claims are. That Billy Graham, I think, enabled exactly what Franklin Graham has become, which is to say that the incident that you described is buried. It's not really where evangelical Protestantism is today. I wish it were.
Thank you. Well, colleagues at Notre Dame and elsewhere who have never attended the seminar American Religion are always amazed when I tell them that we have these 3-hour conversations on Saturday mornings that are endlessly engaging and could go on for even longer. But it is true, and I have a list of a book to write and several more to read, and I know many of us are leaving with those ideas, which is a testament to a great book and also a wonderful conversation. So I'm grateful to all of you. I did want to ask our panelists if they want a final word. Any final insights you'd like to add? We'll give you the opportunity.
Sure. Well, thank you very much again for the book and for these comments. Not being a historian of American religion, or global Christianity for that matter, it's been enormously illuminating. So thank you for that. Again, I would echo what Kathy has said about how a terrific book like this is provocative and leaves us with all sorts of the crumbs, the breadcrumbs, a track for many, many more studies. And I suppose the one that I keep coming back to, or I've come back to in the course of our conversation here, is more work clearly on non-elite subjects and those who are on the receiving end of the missionary experience, if you like, the converted, the indigenous people, more trees, I guess, particularly from kind of that end, I think would really fill out and help us answer, I think, some of the questions that have percolated here. Yeah, and yes, I agree. And I just want to say again, the fact that there has been so much good critical conversation here, both criticisms, constructive thoughts for other projects. It's just, as we all know, it's been a Talmudic commentary to bring out another Jewish example, and it's just a testament to the richness of this book and the impact I think it will have for years to come.
I really appreciate the whole conversation here and the reactions I've had from many of you, both in this discussion and privately. I want to underscore one thing about my own orientation to this, and that is that I've tried very hard in this book and the other things that I have written to offer claims and evidence that I hope would persuade people of a variety of orientations of the truth value of what I'm actually claiming in the book. So it's an effort to speak to people across various lines, to speak on the basis of some common understanding of evidence and reasoning. So if I wanted to, say, defend my view of what the whole world is about, it would be different. Now, my view of what the whole world is about informs this book, obviously, but the book, I've tried to make it something that people who might differ about spiritual matters from the way I think about them would nonetheless find something in the book that would be persuasive and helpful. And I think that too often in the history profession, things get divided up by identity, and the failure of my mainstream colleagues to address religion for 100 years is an example of that. There's all sorts of ethnic and political divisions as well as religious divisions that I think we should try to cross. So without denying that those divisions are there, I've really tried in this book to speak to people, including those who don't see the whole world the way I do. And one of the things that's refreshing about this discussion is that I think I've gotten through to some of you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in the spring.